Hello, my name's Alice. I'm here this morning and I was just doing some pondering, and I thought that maybe I could put some words to some things I've been thinking about, language and trauma and the practice of therapy and the justice system in the United States and in the West, and victims advocacy. It's a little hot, so I'm trying to actually see if I can not ramble so much. But that's a little hard for me, because there's so many things in my brain that connect to other things. So that's why I'm trying to find what I think are really actually super helpful kind of tutorial videos about stuff like meditation and trance and mantras and trauma healing, to actually kind of give some concrete tools for people who are looking to get some practical tips about how to move through trauma without dredging it up in the meantime. And also, I want to be talking about, and I have been doing some videos about the divine feminine and the divine masculine, and these kinds of dualistic concepts that really have to do with stuff that sounds like it's going to be over everybody's head, because it's actually like quantum mechanics. But it's really just like the implicit stuff about how life works, and it turns out we all have an inner sense of how to access this kind of information, and we all have an inner capacity to understand concepts like this. And I think in the West there's been a practice of discouraging people from being able to, I don't even maintain the belief or even have a belief that they could understand these concepts. So people kind of stay away from it, the artists and the people who are maybe better with words, or they think of themselves as being better with words or better with relationships or things like that. People think that means that these concepts in physics aren't really within their capacity of understanding, and it's actually really not true. And I want to figure out, it's hard to put in words, and this is some of the first that I've put it in words because I don't really have anybody to talk to about it, but so it's an interesting exercise, and it is definitely a calling of mine to try to figure out how to put some more practical and relatable language to these concepts. And there are a lot of people who do this, but to the extent that I can offer some perspective, because I have a background in counseling psychology and the theories around how to heal from trauma, and I really think of myself as being sort of an expert in areas of attachment in human relationships, and what that means is that's just a word that you know the word attachment maybe, but in psychology and biology and in animal behavior, attachment is kind of a word that means like the quality of a person's relationship to all other beings, and specifically it's usually used in terms of like talking about attachment to one's caregiver or attachment to the mother. There's a lot of, that's a big focus for people who practice in maternal care and let me think, any kind of areas of trauma with child psychology and childbirth and relationships, couples relationships. Okay. Yeah, so I have this background over there, and then also just kind of this overlay of a bunch of different stuff. So that's why I want to try to bring some of this stuff together, because it's really cool to me, the way that these concepts all come together. But it's all like, for me, it's all originally stuff that I think is cool. So I don't know, there might be like one person in the world who thinks this is interesting and it might just be me, but here I am talking about it. So today I was thinking a lot about how language let's see, I'm already hot. I might have to move. I have to move to the shade. Okay, so I was thinking about wanting to try to put into words some thoughts that I've had about, like, let's see, language and, I don't really like that. Let me just sit down. Yeah. So let's start language and trauma. The intersection of language and trauma in the brain. I'm trouble like finding my entry point. So that's part of my learning curve about my own process here. So I appreciate you bearing with me. Yeah, it's like meta ironic that I'm having that it's hard to put this into words, because that's exactly what I want to talk about. So when a trauma happens to a person, so an event that really makes a person feel psychically threatened, as if there is an impending death that's going to happen on some level. Your cells are afraid they're going to die. So each individual cell has a sense of the experience of the body. And so in that sense, each individual cell sort of has a cognition. So when you are about to receive an impact from something, like say somebody throws a ball at you, your cells implicitly, your nervous system communicates to your cells that there is a ball flying at you, and the ones that, and there are some of them that anticipate this as a potential trauma. So they feel an exhilaration, or there's a little bit of a burst of adrenaline that happens, so that your body can and your body uses that to react and be able to catch the ball. You kind of leverage, there's like a subtle fear that is the energy that helps you to react to catch the ball. Because there are certain cells, your cells in your body are on some level afraid that they're about to be impacted. And even if it's like a pretty soft ball, or it's not, something that you logically are that scared of, at a cellular level, an impact from just a ball tossed lightly, or, a tennis ball just kind of thrown at somebody, at a cellular level, like that could actually, if you were teeny tiny and there was a tennis ball that was being, you can kind of picture, as I'm doing it, kind of picture like there is a tennis ball, like I'm tossing it, and you picture the trajectory and like what it would be like as a cell of your body to see that impending, like terrifying, right? So at a cellular level, there is a protective instinct where your ocular nerves, your eyes, take in the light, and your nervous system. There are a lot of different senses that you're using, and not just sight to be able to catch a ball. There's so much more than just sight that you're using. But you're anticipating that there's a ball coming, and instead of letting it just impact you, you use that fear and you react and you catch it. But what's happening is that, so let's see, so the cells your cells each have life within them, and each cell has a certain level of consciousness, has a certain level of awareness. So even if those individual cells anticipating the tennis ball impact couldn't write an account of what it felt like using emotion words to have that tennis ball be thrown, and to even though the cells themselves can't describe that, they have a certain level of consciousness. That's what consciousness. So I'm kind of just defining like that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about consciousness. So there's a certain level of awareness that your cells have of what is going on in the environment, and that is true of any cell, any atom, at all levels. There is a certain level of consciousness, and depending on what level of consciousness you are, that's where we start to define things as like alive versus not alive. It's actually like a pretty ambiguous spectrum, but what it really has to do with is just like your awareness of your environment. And when you get up to being what we have designated as like life, we call it awareness. But at a lower level, like a cellular level maybe, or I mean not a cellular, but like at a cellular level, maybe we would just say that they have a sort of a sense, or they have certain receptors that do this process and blah blah blah. Or you might talk about the fields that are around them and the electromagnetism that lets the cells communicate with each other and tells them that there's a tennis ball flying through the environment at them, and it's not just a dream. So the cells have a certain level of consciousness. So when a trauma event happens, it's the same kind of thing. So we're talking about our tennis ball being tossed. Let's talk about a house gets dropped on top of you. Just out of that clear blue sky, a house just falls down from the sky and drops on top of you, like you're the Wicked Witch of the East, and Dorothy Gale's house just drops on top of you in Oz, and you don't know where it came from or anything. But so your cells, so there's an impact coming, but this time it's like okay, your consciousness, like you are a witch, but a human. You're a person, so we're imagining that we are the being who's the and it's us, and it's me, and there's a big house that's coming. So that's like terrifying, right? And that would be an impact that would surely kill me in an instant. And so, just like when there's a tennis ball being tossed, and there are certain cells that register that as a threat, when there's a house coming at you from the sky, all of your brain gets to a certain level of conscious awareness of, like, this is really, like, I'm about to die, or you have that fear, you have that thought come in. That is, it's the same. So the same thing is happening as in your cells. It's just a different degree of the same kind of reaction. A different degree of trying to prepare for a trauma reaction. A different degree of trying to put up protections, trying to situate themselves to receive the impact of the trauma, etc. So the cells respond. And so your nervous system keeps track of what is happening throughout this whole process of something coming and falling down from the sky at you. Your nervous system is keeping track of what is happening at any given moment, and knows there's a certain threshold at which your nervous system says, okay, like, there's no way I can run out of the way anymore, and it shuts down, and you go into shock, and you're not going to consciously, your cells recognize that the impact is about to happen, literally, and that the best course of action at that point for your cells' consciousness is to shut off, basically. And what this means is, and so this is like going into shock. It's like it's better for the nervous system maybe to just shut down a certain level of awareness of what's happening and just let the body handle it without any emotion, without triangulating the brain to interpret emotions. So let's remove the sensation of fear. So when you check out, what you're removing is the sensation of fear and the sensation of time itself, actually. Because you have to have time space in order to have fear. Fear is part of what creates time space, actually. But we'll get to that sometime. Okay, so as your cells are anticipating something that might be a trauma, they do oftentimes do something like shut down. And so I'm just gonna kind of fast forward. This is not going to be just like a step-by-step, like what happens as a trauma happens. But when a trauma happens, a lot of times something bad happens, you might be aware that people don't remember, maybe if they've had a car accident, they can't give you like a play-by-play of exactly what happened, or they might sort of blank out at a certain point, or they might say like, oh, my life flashed before my eyes, or something like that. They might even have something like a near-death experience. But but the part that I want to talk about is the amnesia sort of part. So what's interesting about us calling it, we refer to it as a sort of an amnesia, and kind of think of it as like this localized forgetting of something that happens. But in truth, if your cells, so there are a bunch of different levels of consciousness, and only certain levels of consciousness get to go into creating your own ego state, your own framework, your life, your memories, etc. There's only a certain amount of consciousness. There's a lower threshold, and then anything that's above that level of consciousness gets to go into your memories and the creation of the being of yourself and your perception and your sense of yourself. But below that, there's a lot of stuff that's going on. Like cells are doing just infinitesimal things at a microcosmic level, and then a microcosmic level of a microcosmic level of all these things. And so there's this conscious level of awareness, but that's not you're not putting that into your memory of like, okay, and then the protein came by and cell number blah 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 like exerted a electrical pulse. Like, you don't actually put that information, which is happening all the time, but you don't actually encode that information into the part of you that you perceive to be like you, like the actual you yourself, your I am, your ego. So this is like, ego is like classical psychology's word. Before, it meant something to do with vanity. That's not what we're talking about. The ego is just like, this is the character of who I am, basically. Like, if you were to write down a script and hand it off to somebody who is going to be your body double and your mental and emotional double with your memories and things like that, and you were able to just put all that into a file and hand it off to them as like, here's your instructions on how to be me, that's your ego state. Because you wouldn't be able to put in and then cell number blah 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 blah, like flashed an electrical impulse at cell number blah 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 blah, and that you wouldn't put all that in there. That's because that's not part of your ego. It's not part of your own consciousness's sense of self, because your consciousness is much higher than the collective level of your own cells. So the consciousness that is me talking to you, or the consciousness that is you listening to me, is a consciousness that is made up of all of the individual lower frequencies of consciousness of all of your cells, and then likewise for all of their constituent parts, and then likewise for all the constituent parts of the constituent parts, etc. As above, so below. That's what that's talking about. Kind of like use that as a refrain, because it takes these little like tricky things that sound like wordplay. It helps me to like have them referenced in a bunch of different disparate kind of examples, and that's a good one. So so your perception, your ego, the consciousness of your ego, of you, and that's your soul. That's where your soul is involved. That's where the consciousness of your soul is at that level of the ego state, which is made up of all of the information of all the cells put together, blend together into a portrait that is me, being able to interpret this information that I'm telling you and try to put words into it, and simultaneously think about other random things, like what is my dog doing over there? Is the vent on the house in the frame that's kind of ugly? All these things are like going on all the time, and that's me, that's my consciousness, and that is at a level that's higher. It's made up of all of these other little individual consciousnesses of my cells, but it's a higher, more collectivistic consciousness of all those cells. So when your cells shut down and go into shock when a trauma is about to happen, they're not actually really committing that information, the horrible information about what happened, into your ego state, into your ego self. the information that happens during the trauma, so let me say that several times, the information that happens during the trauma that your cells are recording at a lower level of consciousness, even though that would normally be something that you could perceive happening, there's a house flying through the sky at me, your brain, like what feels like the words we say, the brain, or your mind is thinking. Your mind is capable of processing it and maybe remarks upon, there's a house coming at me. But this is sort of an inside out trick that consciousness does, because here's your consciousness up here and it sees the house. And instead of, so at first it goes into hyperconscious awareness and all of the cells are hyper reacting, like, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? But then there's a collectivistic message that's sent up to the ego self that says, Mayday, abort consciousness up there, you got to come down because this might, we don't know what's going to happen. So it's like your ego, yourself, who you are, your soul leaves the part of consciousness that's up here that actually would receive the impact of that house flying at it, and goes into shock and lowers its consciousness level down so that it's just the body reacting at that point. And then there's like, and it's a crisis response. So this happens on a spectrum, like everything is on a spectrum, and not just a dualistic spectrum, but because everything is, even the dualisms are all part and parcel of the spectrum of the whole, which is not just a unique linear thing. But so this, it's a cool, what I'm getting at. Okay, here's what I'm getting at. So consciousness leaves when there's a traumatic event happening, and we think of it as like the body, or you forget something happening, but in actuality, it's that your cells never experienced it. Your consciousness never experienced it. You did not experience that. Your cells experienced it at a lower level of consciousness, but you yourself, your soul, did not experience that. And I was saying that your consciousness goes down lower, but in actuality, it really gets sucked up. And so it's kind of splits. So that was erase the part where I'm talking about it going down, because it really, your consciousness flies up. The frequency of your consciousness, your collectivistic consciousness, goes to a very, very quick, whatever, it rapidly increases in order to eject you out. Ejects your soul out. And people literally have this experience. People literally actually have a memory of your soul being out of your body, or observing something happening. And whether or not you have those types of experiences are to do with your original, how you're wired in the first place, and everything that's happened to you up until that point. So just because you don't have out-of-body experiences does not mean that your soul was not out of your body at the point of a traumatic impact. Because, so it's like your consciousness splits. It goes from being a singular point of consciousness, a collectivistic point of consciousness that is centralized here, somewhere, or actually here, and in your heart, and it's perceiving a death that's about to happen. And so what happens is something that's it's a reaction that's like fear, but what happens is that your consciousness goes to a dipole moment. So it flips, and your soul goes up here, And then the rest of your consciousness, of your nervous system, all of the energy, all of your creative energy, your kundalini energy, your consciousness energy, your sexual energy, your creativity energy, procreative energy, drops in to your cells, and they go into hyper physical 3D like crisis reaction. So that's where people have moments of what seem like superhuman feats. It's because their consciousness has completely saturated all of the cells of the body, and it's this not oversaturation, but it's a response that meets the crisis of the moment with this flooding of that kind of energy to help you react. And it seems like a superpower because it is. Because we have superpowers. We're like superpowers. We have superpowers. Our brains can do really, like, it's really unfortunate how difficult it is to use language around this, because it's like, I want to say that our brains are capable of doing superhuman things, but in fact, to be human is to be super. And that's Sadhguru, I think, is like, he likes to say that. But to be human is a superpower. We just don't actually tap into saturating ourselves with the consciousness, that the level of consciousness that we are capable of. So on the one hand, if you're totally saturated up here, you can do stuff like have out-of-body experiences. If your consciousness is way up here, or if your cells get saturated way down here with your consciousness, and your consciousness drops way down into your body, then people end up doing things that we describe as superhuman, or we say they're miracles, and they kind of get like brushed away from the memory of time, these kind of things, because they seem like anomalies, because most people, like, over on the whole in the West, we don't perceive these things to be real. So, or it just seems like a sort of a bedtime story kind of thing, like, oh, that mother who saved the kid by lifting the car off of them, or, you know, those just seem like these wild stories that the type of people who would never tell you anything that's not like a black and white, like westernized academic scientific peer-reviewed fact, quote unquote, like those type of people might still like to tell you about, like, the anomaly that they heard about a woman who lifted a car off a child, because there's something about that resonates even with the people who have a very kind of a bias towards westernized thought, or a westernized way of thinking, westernized process, cognitive process, I guess. But on the more, but it's like one person might tell that story, but it doesn't become embedded in the collective consciousness, because we don't see it happening all the time, and we don't tell those stories. We don't have a way to cognize and, like, pull together what it is that we're seeing when we are talking about, when there are all these disparate stories about people doing superhuman things, or people having out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences. It's because the consciousness just is moved. That is the power of our consciousness moving around in the levels of our reality, moving around the levels of the veil. So way down here, actually, you get really, really super low in the low frequency. It's like a percussion. There's like a beat. And all of the cells and all of the atoms on the planet at a certain level all together make the same, have the same low frequency, and that underlies everything. So we all share this baseline kind of percussion line, this baseline frequency, and it's the same frequency that I share, the same baseline frequency, that my cells are playing that same baseline frequency as the bushes over here behind me, or the trees, or that cricket. And that is, at that level, that's a level of consciousness. And it's like there's a consciousness that our cells carry that runs to the very, very, very beginning of what we call time or time space, which is not even that long ago, the very beginning of time, ironically. It's like once you really start digging in, the farthest reaches of space are just the same places as like this, just the same places right here, and the farthest reaches of time are the same thing as right here. That's what the multiverse is about. I'll talk about that later. But anyway, okay, so your cells like don't actually process trauma happening. So what's messed up, or sort of this flaw that's developed in the way that we do our system, is that we assume that in order for something to be true, there has to be language, a certain type of language, that can be put to it. So I think I have to like giggle about it, because otherwise I'm gonna sob. But we have been messing up. We've really been messing up when we have been forcing people to talk about their traumas when the language is not otherwise flowing. We've been messing up when we force people to talk about and put language to trauma, to things that have happened, when there's not otherwise language around the event. So this happens at so many levels of our society. You go to therapy, you think you're supposed to start talking about and putting words to all these things that have happened to you. Or that's a conception about therapy. And there are many different ways of practicing therapy, and a lot of different very valid peer-reviewed ways that are not just cognitive behavioral therapy. Look into, people brand different types of therapy and can make money from media not understanding how peer review works. So there are a lot of different types of therapy that are more effective than cognitive behavioral therapy. The media doesn't get it, so cognitive behavioral therapy, that's cognitive therapies focus so much on making people put language to certain things that have happened to them, bringing out the language, transferring an emotional memory to a linguistic one, because there's sort of this implied thing that to move it from somewhere invisible where it must be being felt all the time, and to put those feelings into words and language, that is to somehow make it less, that is to somehow remove the effect of what that is, or that is a method of processing something. What we've gotten wrong, what has been twisted, is that yes, the human naturally accesses language as a way of making sense of trauma, as a way of making sense of and processing the different events that have happened. However, the human, the soul, does not put everything into language. Because remember, we don't put into language, and then this protein swam by, and by that I got the information that I should send a message to the other cell, blah, 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 blah. We don't put that stuff into language, and there's a reason. Like, think how cluttered it would be to be conscious of all of that kind of information. And then think how terrifying it would be to be cluttered with the anxiety of every single individual particle of every cell, and whether it's scared it's about to die or not. What if your consciousness could actually remember and put language to all of that? Think about how frantic your experience would be. So there's an evolutionary reason as to why we only put certain things into language. It's an adaptation when we don't put things into language. So yes, and it's an adaptation when we do put things into language. It's another one of those where it's sort of, there are different ways that the mind reacts, and there are different levels of adaptation and what would be appropriate in certain situations, what would be most advantageous to the life and the consciousness that's there. So we okay, let me think. So when you have a crime happen to you, or when you are in a traumatic situation or scenario, and sometimes, a lot of the time, probably more often than not, trauma is experienced over a duration of time, not just like a one-off, like getting smacked by a house flying down from the sky. A trauma is more like people had ongoing sense of doom during childhood, ongoing sense of everything is going to fall apart during school, or traumas happen at a slow burn level as well. An ongoing sense of I am not worthy, or I am stupid because I don't know because I can't get my brain to focus on what the teacher's talking about. And nobody says that I'm ADD, so I must be stupid. But stuff like that can be something that maybe a kid thinks in their private brain, and then it can be a slope over time that can turn into a trauma. Which is an experience that makes you feel like you're going to die on some level. Because to be in those type of situations, for a child to be unloved or to be unworthy, or for everything to fall apart, for a child at an evolutionary level, that really could mean death. If you're completely reliant on caregivers for everything to fall apart, that means death. So there, but when we do not follow the lead of what an individual's soul is saying that it needs in order to help heal the trauma, we are inflicting exponential levels of pain and suffering onto people who have already experienced trauma, who have already experienced suffering, who are already suffering. What we're doing instead of, when we make people put language to things, what we're doing is we're taking the frequencies of the experiences, the memories of the experiences, we're taking the frequencies and putting them into a place where we are actually crystallizing them, instead of letting them be at a frequency level where they will over time be shaken out and released without ever touching the soul's sense of itself and sense of being. Instead of letting them do that, when we force people to put words to things, when police come in and interview people and ask and force them to put words to excruciating things that have just happened that the brain is trying to not experience, which is brilliant that it can do that, but we totally screw it up and pull the rug out from under our whole species when we think that going in and asking trauma victims to, and we know that, on an intuitive level, we know that that's terrible to go in and you see people interviewed on the news, and everyone, I mean, everyone has had the thought at some point of like, why are we interviewing this poor person whose son just died, or who's it literally happened an hour ago, and it's a wailing person who should not be forced to put words to what has happened and be forced to tell it over and over again as the reporter asks a bunch of different ways of tell me exactly what happened. Literally what's happening in that moment is that person is the experience of what has happened is being forced upon the cells over and over and over again with much more impact. And to put words to it, the reason that it's words are associated with our ability to use our brain, our neocortex and the prefrontal cortex of our species, because we're taking thoughts and we're literally transforming them we're lowering their frequencies and crystallizing them into matter that we can perceive in the third dimension of the universe. We're taking frequencies that are way up here, just really fast ones, that are already kind of moving out of the level of experience of the soul. They're trying to get away. They're fluttering away. It's like a little cinder flying off of a log that's been burning. So it's floating away, which is very helpful. It's like clearing it, your body clears it. But when we make people put words to it and keep making them do that, you're literally you're forcing and injecting brain matter and white matter to gray matter, really, to the experience, these the worst experiences of people's lives. And we have this catch-22 system, and I shouldn't use that phrase because I haven't actually read that book, but even though I stole somebody's copy, and I'm sorry, I'll get it back one day, inadvertently. But we have this catch-22 system where you can't, where it's in order to be able to be recognized as a being who needs care or who needs recognition or remuneration or retribution for something that's happened to you, needs healing. In order to be recognized, you as the being, you need to have already put it into your sense of self. You need to have already suffered from the impact of that on the worst and most egregious levels. You have to have already done that in order for you to be recognized as somebody who needs help. I'm saying that's the catch-22 of our system, is that we don't recognize people as victims unless they can put words to what has happened to them. But for the most heinous types of things that happen, the most heinous traumas, our mind, our species has evolved out of putting language to the worst things that happen to us, because to put language to something is to crystallize it into the matter of our brain, which makes it much more difficult to expel, makes it much more difficult to get to remove the information, remove those memories, if those memories have been encoded at the level of the actual waterlogged, mushy brain inside of this body. It is way more difficult to shake off things that have happened when you put it into the brain, because the brain is continuing to communicate with every single cell. So all the cells that had so brilliantly and masterfully not even experienced what happened, they all did a ballerina twirl and they literally did not experience what happened. They didn't experience a death. They didn't experience anything. You're literally telling those cells, hang on, go back and let it happen to you though, so that we can make it okay for you. Like, so go you have to have already died in order for you to be compensated for your loss of life. So go do that. And the cells are like, but I did the thing that I'm supposed to do, and I ejected and did the trick, and we didn't die. We didn't experience that. The consciousness of my cell didn't experience it. The consciousness of that cell didn't experience it. The consciousness didn't experience it. Say it in a bunch of ways, because the language is just imprecise even when I'm being all wordy and everything. The consciousness didn't experience it. But when we force people to put language to their traumas, when there's not otherwise language flowing, we are not only re-traumatizing people, but we are fundamentally exacerbating what happened, and we're almost literally inflicting the same experience on the cells over and over again, which we're trying to help people heal from. It's extremely disturbing, and I'm not sure, it's hard to say that this is how our system works, is that because once you put words to a trauma, it's and I've really, really, really noticed this in the past couple of years when I've been trying to move past some severe traumas in my life and relationship, getting past a really dismal, abusive relationship, for which my cells were basically doing ballerina twirls through a lot of it, trying not to experience it. So this is like a fight or flight. This is fight or flight reaction, is what happens. This is all fight or flight. I should have said that at the beginning. And fight or flight, I really mean that's not just fight or flight. The other types of reactions to fear are much more prevalent, such as dissociating, checking. That means you check out. Your consciousness checks out. It's way more advantageous for the cell to check out and do the little ballerina twirl. That's a much more masterful trick than for the cell to put on its armor and really battle against the impending threat, or spend a bunch of energy physically trying to outpace the threat and move out of the way using time space to do that. Whereas a ballerina twirl is a quantum trick, and that's where you can move your consciousness, and if the consciousness leaves the cell, then the cell can still exist without actually having received the impact. But when we put words, when we make people put words to things that they don't already have words for, we are making them solidify traumas in their brains. We are exacerbating victimhood And we are repeatedly raping rape victims as we make them put words to these things. You're literally, like, that's how the cells experience it. When you make people move the conscious experience into a level where there's language, that is an area of your mind where there are not supposed to be memories of experience of things like rape. In the area of your mind that does language, that is supposed to be one of the outermost external light-filled areas of your brain, meaning that it is not supposed to, you don't carry memories of the most heinous things that have happened to you in the graphic way that you might if you could remember them way down here at the level of fear, where fear actually vibrates. At that level where the fight or flight response is kicked off. Fight, flight, freeze, faint, like a possum. Possums really just do a little quantum trick when they leave. And they can be passed out for like 14 hours when they do that. So, and it's not just a sleep. Their consciousness is not there. It's like as close to death as you could get. So, it's very similar to what our cells do when we're about to experience a trauma as well. And then when we make people put language to it, we are abusing people on a mass scale. Our society is doing it all wrong. It's doing it all wrong. And therapists really want to help, and we can only do what the research backs. But there can only be research on stuff that people want to pay money to be researched. And if there's not a big amount of funding for wellness and people actually being better, then you don't see, that's why, there's not therapies that are really accounting for this very obvious thing. I mean, now that I like think about it and notice it, it's seemingly very obvious to me that we should, like, why haven't we noticed this? Like, why are we doing this to people, making them put language to things? And we know this in some ways. EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, is something that I've been trained in for a long time. And so there are areas where we know that, or where there's like a sense that less language can actually be helpful and can speed up our processing of things. But when we receive victims reporting crimes and treat them in certain ways, and then make them tell their stories over and over again, when we receive our friends and families who are coming to us for help when they've had something terrible happen, and we just pepper them with questions and ask them why, and how did that happen, and what did that look like, and ask for details, and ask questions that force people to put language to things that they haven't had language for, and make people bring visuals into their brains, into their mind space, that are extremely disturbing. When you're asking people questions, you're prompting their mind to bring an image in, to bring a thought in, to bring language in. Asking people questions is very intrusive. It's also how we relate to each other. It's part of the way that we relate to each other. But we don't understand the power of the questions that we ask. We always need to be mindful about what we are making people put language to. What stories we are leading people to be able to tell about themselves. Are we leading people to tell a story about themselves that makes them feel helpless? Or are we leading people and helping them to tell a story about a truth, but in a way that makes them recognize their power over it. To recognize their survivorship rather than their victimhood. Where I live, there's not much survivorship. And a lot of the time, I think, really people are just so cut off from each other that we kind of forget what it is to really tune into what somebody's really talking about and what somebody's really saying. And we just sort of mindlessly, we have these like parroted phrases that we just say to people, like, oh, the patriarchy, oh, the system sucks, I'm so sorry that happened to you. It's like, no, it's still happening. Oh yeah, the system sucks. We don't actually, but it's like the people don't actually think about what you're saying to, when you say to somebody who's a victim, when you try to offer sympathy and you just say to them stuff about like, oh yeah, God, the patriarchy, I can't believe that the patriarchy is still doing blah, blah, blah. I can't believe the system is so terrible. That does not help. All you're doing is passing on your own narrative of helplessness to somebody who's, if you're even aware of their victimhood, they are doing a way better job of surviving whatever it is in their life than you could possibly understand. So for you to put language to something for somebody else that assigns victimhood to them, that is fundamentally abusive. You're literally forcing them to take memories that are up here, or consciousness that is up here that they've already been able to turn into fuel. You are pulling down that stuff and you're throwing it back on the floor for them to clean up. And you're telling them a narrative about themselves which they had already done a really good job of ballerina twirling out of the way to avoid. To have a narrative assigned to you about yourself, to be forced to put language to something for which you don't already have language, to have language forced upon you, to have you told how to pronounce your name, to have you told all the time whether or not you are a valid person as to whether you can speak correctly or pronounce things in a certain way. Those types of narratives, you are literally throwing brain matter at somebody that's like contributing to their sense of self. And you might be trying to help by offering empathy or sympathy, but what you're really doing, all you're doing is telling somebody about you. Because that language that you're putting to somebody else, that's your language for yourself. The only things that we have words for are the things that have to do with us. So don't tell people about their victimhood, because you're throwing sludge at other life. You are throwing sludge on other people's consciousness, their ability to love, their ability to learn, their ability to be present, their ability to be your friend, to offer you help. The more that we're weighed down with the sludge of all these narratives of how shitty life is and how much we're all victims, and the more we're laden with all this graphic language about how to describe rapes and whether or not something was really a punch or whether it was a slap or whether you were shoved or whether you were thrown, when you have to put language to it like that, to stuff that you don't already have language for, you're fragmenting the actual truth, because the truth is up here. The truth is always way up here, because the truth is your consciousness. And when you put language to something that there's not already language, you're bringing in something that has nothing to do with you, and you're fragmenting the truth, which means that you're basically, it's like shattering a beautiful crystal bowl or a beautiful crystal on the ground, letting it fall and have impact in the 3D, and it shatters into a million pieces that it's impossible to put them back together, and they're all embedded in in your brain in all different places, and we just need to stop doing this to each other. And I'm not sure exactly what the solution is to the overall system, except, I mean, the solution is that we need to stop trying to think of solutions for everything. The solution is actually that we need to stop trying to look for problems everywhere we go. We need to stop asking people lines of questioning that force them to tell stories that paint them as helpless or paint them as a victim. We need to do a better job of listening to the stories that aren't there, listening to when people have silences that need to stay silent. Pay attention to when there are silences that seem like they want to be, that there's something that needs to be heard there. Don't ask closed-ended questions. Don't ask yes or no questions. Ask open-ended questions. And don't start your questions with why. That's a therapy trick. I'm not saying, anybody has a bad intent when they're doing this stuff. It's just kind of how we're programmed and how we're conditioned in our society. But we have let it get way out of hand, and you see this like mass soul death that happens in our society at very young ages, where people just kind of go unconscious and like just kind of go about their life and do all these programmed things that don't really make that much sense once you really start looking and examining like your values and things like that. It's really because people are laden with so much sludge that's been thrown at them that their consciousness has to go down to like a lower level programming, where you go to a script and you just start checking boxes